Is it on? Okay. For a long time, the people had been talking of violence, of the day when they would fight the white man and win back the country. As the leaders, we supported the use of peaceful means. That was the position of our leader, Comrade Kaunda. But when we discussed this in 1961, it could not be denied that our policy to achieve a non-racial state by non-violence means had failed, and that our followers were beginning to lose patience and were developing disturbing ideas of violent rebellion.
On October 23, 1964, at exactly 11:56 p.m., the Union Jack, the blue and red national flag of the United Kingdom, was lowered and replaced by a green, red, orange and black flag with the fish eagle. The Zambian flag was hoisted slightly after midnight, signaling the end of colonial rule and the dawning of a new era, and at its helm as first Republican president of Zambia was the man Kenneth David Kaunda. His slightly stooping stride is firm and purposeful. His demeanor quick, natural, and courteous. He speaks carefully, pausing occasionally to weigh his every word. At 40 years old, Kaunda is a figure of international significance. He has traveled the world, met presidents and kings, sold second-hand clothes, and spent nights in prison. He's at once outstanding in and typical of the generation that had risen up in the 1900s to change the course of the African continent and to free its people.
The Africans wanted to trade right from the word go. They wanted to sell their labor. From Malawi and northern Rhodesia, they used to go down into South Africa. You had a movement of people. People wanted to learn. They wanted to meet each other. So it was a natural thing that the outside world should get involved with Africa.
By the mid-1800s, the so-called scramble for Africa was at its peak. The British Empire, Pax Britannica, found itself pitted against other imperial powers in an existential race to control the vast territories of Africa and exploit both its resources and its people.
Africans were not aware that there were conferences being organized in Berlin to determine about them. No, they did not know about it. They only saw the consequences.
And they justified it by saying that they were bringing civilization and Christianity to these benighted, primitive people.
The area around the Zambezi became known to the British through the exploits of Dr. David Livingstone. Livingstone's journeys in the 1850s were avidly followed by the British as they embodied the qualities that Victorians prized: an adventurer, a devout Christian, and anti-slavery campaigner. Dr. Livingstone is said to have brought one of the so-called 3 C's of British imperialism, and that was Christianity. The other 2 C's of commerce and civilization would come through another man's boyish dreams.
In the 1870s, the land around the little town of Kimberley, in what is now South Africa, was found to contain the richest deposits of diamonds in the world. Europeans in search of quick and easy profits rushed into the area. Among them was a young Englishman who'd come to South Africa at the age of 17. His name was Cecil Rhodes.
Rhodes was an astute and ambitious businessman, politician, and mining magnate who fancied himself an empire builder. He neither drank nor smoked, and his only obsession was to see the high plateau of Central and Eastern Africa settled and controlled by the British, while he himself carved out a lucrative niche in the mineral-rich areas of Katanga, the Limpopo, and of course, the Zambezi. Though Rhodes was not different from other white supremacists interested in Africa at the time, he was at the same time unique, describing his mission in Africa as one of conquest, but not with war, but money. His vision was to connect all British colonies from Cape to Cairo, a vision he saw when he came face to face with death. In 1872, Cecil John Rhodes suffered a heart attack while working with his brother in the diamond fields of Kimberley in South Africa. After his recovery, with renewed ambition, he and his brothers set out in search of gold in the interior. However, this endeavor was largely unsuccessful, as both men and the environment in the interior were harshly hostile. The Rhodes brothers did not have any means nor resources to undertake such a risky expedition. The attempt was abandoned and Rhodes returned to the United Kingdom in 1873 to complete his studies, but the desire to penetrate the interior did not end there. When leaving for the UK, Rhodes left his diamond fields in the care of his partner, Charles D. Rudd. As their business investments began to pay off, he and his partner launched the De Beers Mining Company in 1880. In 1888, Rhodes formed the British South Africa Company, and the following year, he applied for a charter from the United Kingdom to expand the empire. Having built up a strong reputation, the charter was granted almost immediately, and shortly after that, Rhodes initiated his grand scheme of complete domination through the use of diplomacy, conspiracy, and the weapon of mass destruction.
Whatever happens, we have got the maxim, and they have not.
Until way into the second half of the 19th century, African societies had successfully guarded the continent against unwelcome European invaders. However, in the decades leading up to the 1880s, a number of rapid technological developments took place in Europe that shifted the balance of power in the fight for Africa in favor of the invaders.
In many instances, the British did not actually have to go to war. Just the threats of war, the fact that there were all these big, powerful guns was enough to force the local chiefs to sign a treaty.
Most notably, the development of the Maxim gun, a semi-automatic weapon, proved a crucial factor in European conquest of Africa. Due to its increased speed of fire and the fact that it was relatively light to carry, it became the standard machine gun for Europeans in Africa, a weapon of mass destruction employed on the African battlefield with deadly consequences. Without a doubt, between 1880 and 1920, the disparity in military power between the Africans and the Europeans was at its peak. Though many African societies did possess firearms, and often in large quantities, the guns introduced in Africa, especially by the so-called independent rogue traders, were more often than not of low quality, inaccurate, or slow-firing varieties. This was not surprising, as it was standard practice by European merchants and the government officials to ship defective firearms to Africa. Thus, in the 1700s, for example, it is estimated that only 4 out of every 50 trade guns at the Cape could fire. By the early 1890s, the BSAC had raised and equipped its police force. However, contrary to the provisions contained in the charter, the BSAC had equally raised a paramilitary force of mounted infantrymen. It was this force that helped the company overcome the Matabele Kingdom and the Shona north of the Limpopo in the First and Second Matabele War between 1893 and 1897. And it was during these wars that the British first used the Maxim gun in combat and caused over 5,000 Ndebele fatalities. After the successful occupation of Mashonaland, European settlements multiplied in the area as per the colonial office's intent. The British flag was raised and the area was renamed Rhodesia, after Cecil John Rhodes himself. But Rhodes was not done yet. During the same period, the BSAC had its charter extended to give it power to further administer the territory to the north of the Zambezi. It was then that attention was turned to the foremost impediments to effective British occupation of the Northern Territories, the organized Lozi and the proud Ngoni. Fortunately for the BSAC, subjugation of the Lozi in the western part would be achieved relatively easy, with the Lozi's downfall actually beginning in the 1700s before most Europeans ever stepped in Africa. In the 1700s, a Southern African group of Sototwana heritage called the Kololo had managed to conquer the local inhabitants who were migrants from the fallen Luba and Lunda states called Luyana. The Luyana had established the Barotse kingdom on the floodplains of the Zambezi upon their arrival from Katanga. Under the Kololo, Kololo customs, language and traditions were imposed upon the Luyana until they revolted and overthrew the Kololo following the 1851 death of the Kololo conqueror Sebetwani. Now fearful of attacks from the Portuguese in Angola to the west and the Ndebele in the east, Lewanika, king of Barotse, sought to put his kingdom under British protection. King Lewanika is said to have unwittingly signed the Lochner Concession in June 1890, which essentially put Barotseland under the authority of the BSAC and effectively turned the Barotse kingdom into northwestern Rhodesia. With the Lozis taken care of, attention was turned to the east. In the eastern part of the Northern Territory, the most dominant native group were the proud Ngoni people. The Ngoni were a warrior society with a big reputation for bravery and little patience for negotiation. Further, unlike the Luyana, Ngoni kings seem to have only one policy for dealing with foreign aggression, whether African or European: war. In December 1897, unknown to his father the king, Nsingo, crown prince of the Ngoni people, led a revolt against British settlers. The attack began with laying siege to the North Chartered Exploration Company at Fort Young. However, it is said Europeans played on the actions of Nsingo and his men to justify invading Ngoni land, finally getting rid of Mpezeni and effectively controlling his kingdom. Thus, after the so-called Ngoni rebellion was ruthlessly put down, Mpezeni accepted Pax Britannica, and his part of the country became known as Northeastern Rhodesia. Initially, Northeastern Rhodesia and Barotseland Northwestern Rhodesia were administered as separate units until 1911, when they were finally merged to form Northern Rhodesia, a British protectorate. By the early 1900s, Cecil Rhodes' plan seemed to have succeeded. However, by 1920, the BSAC had begun losing favor with most European settlers and thus were equally losing control of the region. The company's fallout with the white settlers was compounded by the BSAC's stipulations that offered a measure of protection for black Africans, which many white settlers passionately resented. To them, it seemed Rhodes and the BSAC had developed a soft spot for the natives. By 1922, the BSAC had lost nearly all its power and influence and handed over control to the white settlers. The settlers in turn now had the liberty of changing the constitution and, unsurprisingly, abandoned legislation that protected black Africans, passing punitive and restrictive laws instead. Most notably, the settlers promulgated laws that reserved over 50% of the land for their small white community. In 1924, the British government officially terminated the BSAC's charter to administer Northern Rhodesia and declared the territory a British protectorate. By then, it was all but too late. Unknowingly, Cecil Rhodes and the BSAC had sown the seed that would give rise to political consciousness among the Africans. And in the same year that the charter was terminated, a very special child was born. When he was born, the boy was nicknamed Buchizia, the unexpected one, born to his parents in their 20th year of marriage. The day was Friday, October 24th, 1924, the year that the BSAC's charter to administer the Northern Territory was terminated. His father, Julius David Kaunda, came to Northern Rhodesia as an evangelist in 1905 at the age of 27, with his wife Helen Jengwera Nyirenda, who was the first qualified African woman teacher in the area, and Hezekiah Konjera, a teacher and freed Bemba slave. Fortunately for the trio, when they arrived in Chinsali district, the native commissioner R.A. Young, also known as Bobo, received them well and built them a house and a school to start what would come to be known as Lubwa Mission. Now, the movement of Julisia and the other two teachers was not coincidental. In fact, as part of the Livingstonia mission of the United Free Church of Scotland, they were on a divine assignment from the Mother Church itself. Their task was simple, and their instructions were to reach Bemba land and forestall the expansion of other missionary societies in the northeastern Rhodesia and Nyasaland. On top of the list of the missionaries that had to be stopped were the White Fathers. The Catholic White Fathers were the largest and one of the earliest missionary societies to settle in the Central African region. In northern Rhodesia, their first station was among the Mambo in the Tanganyika-Malawi corridor, established in 1891 via the so-called Stevenson Road. The White Fathers taught salvation through sacraments and baptism and were very popular, especially given the fact that they were the only missionary society funded substantively by their mother church. As such, they are said to have been able to pay congregants as well as their children to attend their schools. On the other hand, for Lubwa Mission, salvation was through individual faith in Christ, and as such, the mission stressed the education of Africans in practical skills.
When you talk of the mission of the church at that time, of course, was to preach the gospel, and as well as providing the services, social services for the people, for the community. And the services they provided, one of them was education as well as health.
As one of the founders of Lubwa Mission, Julius Kaunda was known for his dedication to the Christian ideals of justice, service, and freedom. It was these traits that defined him as a catechist, and it was these traits that would be inherited by his youngest son, Kenneth Kaunda. Growing up as a young boy, it was a warm, happy, and secluded life in the sanctuary of Lubwa Mission for young Kenneth. Fortunate that both his parents were well educated and that his father's work had led to the establishment of Lubwa Mission, which included a school, Kenneth had the rare privilege in those days of beginning his education at the young age of 7. As the youngest child, Kenneth was evidently the favorite of his father, though his parents ensured he was never spoiled by tempering kindness with discipline. Unfortunately, when Kenneth was only 8, his father David Kaunda died, leaving a family in shock and a deep wound from which it would take years for young Kenneth to recover. As a young student, Kenneth was described as a shy and timid boy, one who would rather go hungry than ask for food. But Reverend Maxwell Robertson, the principal, saw something more in young Kenneth and introduced him to football and the Boy Scouts. It was during this period that Kenneth also discovered the guitar and began composing his own songs. Reverend Robertson took it upon himself to mentor young Kenneth and taught him the importance of hard work and the value of helping others. And soon, from a shy and timid boy, Kenneth became more assertive and later joined other boys in community works such as carrying water for the elderly and helping out in the field. Meanwhile, in the mid-1930s, on the Copperbelt province, not far from Chinsali, things were less tranquil. In fact, there was chaos. In 1935, for the first time in history, African mine workers at Mufulira, Nkana, and Ron Antelope mines went on strike. At Ron, indiscriminate use of force by the police left several strikers wounded and 6 dead. Elsewhere, there was less violence and soon the strikers went back to work. However, brief and seemingly ineffective as the strikes were, they served to show both the Africans and the Europeans that Africans were already conscious of a common interest and were capable of organizing concerted resistance. For this reason, the 1935 African workers' strike was considered by many as the birth of African nationalism. As the copper belt was on fire back in Chinsali, it became apparent that Kenneth was a brilliant student and a natural-born leader. As such, he was earmarked for teacher training when he completed Standard 6 in 1938. And in 1941, Kenneth Kaunda became one of the first pupils at Munali, Northern Rhodesia's first African secondary school. Munali was intended as Northern Rhodesia's principal school for talented native boys. And it was during his time at Munali that Kenneth made his first acquaintance with life outside the sanctuary of Luwa and met with the harsh reality of colonial rule. Notably, in one incident at Broken Hill, uniformed policemen ordered him off a path that was reserved for Europeans only. This was a shock to Kaunda, who, having grown up in a Christian mission, had never been too exposed to one of the stark features of colonial life: racism. In 1943, Luba Mission faced a shortage of manpower due to the outbreak of World War II, and as a result, Kaunda was summoned back from Munali. Back at Luba Mission, Kaunda taught at the school and became head teacher before his 21st birthday. He also taught in then Tanganyika, where he became a lifelong admirer of the future president, Julius Nyerere. Over time, through his teaching and preaching as a deacon in the church, Kaunda gradually overcame his shyness, though it took a bit longer to overcome his shyness with the ladies. Fortunately for him, his mother had already chosen a wife, a young girl from Mpika, daughter of Kaweche Banda and Milika Sakala. For Kaunda, life seemed to have been turning out as everyone would have expected for a young, educated African at the time. A good job, a lovely young wife, and high prospects for the future. But one thing still haunted Kaunda: his racist experience at Broken Hill. And soon this would push him from the sanctuary of the mission and his mother's apron strings to take on the real world, challenge the status quo, and free his people. In 1947, after 4 years of teaching, Kaunda decided to follow a different path. Thus, he and his new wife, alongside 2 friends from Luba, Simon Kapwepwe and John Sokoni, set off southwards to pursue their dreams. To support themselves, they engaged in farming and performed different odd jobs to raise money. Kaunda and his wife further began teaching in Mufulira, and to add to their joint income, they sold second-hand clothes from Congo known as Salaula. But more important than their travels and part-time jobs, Kaunda and his friends became the pioneering members of the newly formed African National Congress. And soon the 3 friends decided to return to the northern province to expand their political activities. Between 1941 and 1953, Luba's trace on agricultural development was linked to its idea of developing a self-supporting, self-governing and self-propagating church in Chinsali district. And due to the worsening food situation in the province, which began in 1941, a few ex-teachers from Luba formed the Chinsali Young Men's Farming Association. However, the association was only fully functional in 1949 when Kaunda, its secretary, treasurer and manager, resigned from his teaching work amidst reports of misconduct and suspension by the church council. After the incident, Kaunda took time to retire from the world and to refresh his spirit, spending time meditating in nature, ending up in what he called God's laps, a place almost entirely free from consciousness. During these troubled times, music became a great comforter to Kaunda, and he composed a number of songs expressing his feelings, desires, and worldview. Kaunda would also take walks in nature with his guitar, and on one particular occasion, he got so lost in his thoughts that he was only awoken by the presence of a large, deadly snake. Kaunda barely survived the encounter, and it was at that point that he knew he had to resume the struggle. By the late 1940s, African welfare associations were established at all district headquarters to discuss matters of welfare affecting Africans. The only problem was their discussions were anything but welfare related, and more often than not, the topics that took center stage were politics. In Chinsali, the chairman of the Chinsali Welfare Association was then Daniel Ovesa, an evangelist from Lugwa. Other members included Tom Sabi, Ruben C. Mlenga, Moses K. Mumba, John Singoi, Robert Makasa, and of course, Kenneth Kaunda. So African welfare societies were doubling in politics. This definitely had to be stopped. But how? As time went by, government efforts to control African political development proved futile. As an alternative, the government tried to meet African political ambitions by modernizing the traditional system of government through chiefs and councils. In addition, welfare associations and similar bodies could elect one representative from each district as a part-time councillor of the superior native authority. But this didn't stop Africans from pursuing other avenues for political activism. By 1950, Africans took their political ambitions a step further and established the Chinsali branch of the Northern Rhodesia African Congress. The party's first president was Godwin Lewanika, a Barotseland native from an aristocratic background. The Congress was the first African political party in Northern Rhodesia and had its roots in the Federation of Welfare Societies with links to the African National Congress in South Africa. Unlike the Welfare Association, the Congress refused to be an arm of colonial administration under the control and direction of the district commissioner. At inception, African political formations faced a myriad of problems. But by far, the most pressing and charged political issue in the 1950s that preoccupied the Northern Rhodesia African Congress was the proposed amalgamation of Northern and Southern Rhodesia. Across Chinsali district, there was a general fear that if the federation was actualized, it would attract large numbers of European settlers and subsequent loss of land and other rights and liberties for the Africans in the Northern Territory.
North of the Zambezi, the vast river that tumbles over the Victoria Falls, lies Northern Rhodesia, a British protectorate opened up by British pioneering and containing an African population of 2 millions. It's one of the territories concerned in federation, that plan for the development of an area which, in the opinion of its sponsors, is linked with the prospects of a true partnership of races in Central Africa. The famous copper belt of Northern Rhodesia is one of the world's biggest production centers of that important metal, employing both African and European labor. Other industries have grown up as a result of the development of the copper mines, such as this cement works at Chilanga. Northern Rhodesia is developing fast, and cement has become of prime importance for building and road making. This is an illustration of the type of industry which federationists are eager to see extended in the Rhodesias. Western civilization has brought other benefits to this area of Central Africa. Mechanical farming, for instance, to land which only 50 years ago was tribal hunting country inhabited by wild animals. Then hospitals and hygiene. At Broken Hill, a new hospital is opened by the governor, Sir Gilbert Rennie, who is greeted by the leading unofficial member of the legislature, Mr. Roy Walensky. Mr. Walensky here speaks for Northern Rhodesia.
Great opportunity beckons in Central Africa to develop the two Rhodesias and Nyasaland, not only in their interests, but in the interests of interracial partnership in Africa.
Let's begin with two conflicting narratives. Number one, In the 1950s, the British government, aware of the economic disparity amongst its African dependencies, experimented with the creation of Federation of Colonies, apparently to give the poorer territories a better chance at later attaining self-sufficiency. And one such experiment was the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland, which included the British colony of Southern Rhodesia and the two protectorates of Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland.
If we are to create a strong, virile, progressive British state in that very large area of Africa, then a federation is the only solution. It's a great and a stimulating adventure.
The basic argument here was that closer political association among the three Central African territories was essential if they were to develop their resources to the full and reach their proper stature in the world. Individually, these territories were vulnerable. But now, if the rationale behind the Federation was to promote collective development of member states towards self-sufficiency, then why was the initiative so despised by the majority of the population and especially indigenous Africans in Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland? Which brings us to narrative number 2 and the point where things get very ugly. Let's begin with definitions. In simple terms, a federation can be defined as a group of states with a central government but independent in internal affairs. However, in the case of the so-called Central African Federation, one dominating feature was that the central government had overriding powers, and unlike the southern colony, Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland were not actually colonies, and neither were they truly federal states. So what were they? By law, the Central African Federation was an intergovernmental union of the geopolitical British colony of Southern Rhodesia and the protectorates of Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland, established from August 1st to 23rd October 1953, under the imperial initiative of Britain and with the signing of an establishment pact chronicled in terms of the federal constitution and the provisions of the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland Act of 1953.
This was an imperial scheme to make bigger regions out of small countries, to make management of governments easier by Britain.
Fully understand the reasons behind the formation of the Federation, we must consider both the political and economic considerations behind its establishment. Politically, there's an argument that it was actually Gerald Brown, a settler from Zambia, then Northern Rhodesia, that suggested a federation in a 1936 meeting for more effective political control. And it was upon this suggestion that Southern Rhodesia's Prime Minister Godfrey Hudgens provided the driving force behind the federation issue. Of course, effective political control was a benefit of establishing the federation, but it was by no means the main factor behind the decision. The most relevant political consideration at the time was not just effective political control, but also fear of African nationalism. Historian Professor Lewis Gunn notes that
Huggins and his associates were patriots determined to build a powerful British dominion. An imperial bastion that would resist the long-range menace of black nationalism to the north.
Unsurprisingly, the Federation's first appointed Prime Minister was Godfrey Hudgens, first Viscount Malvern, who already served as Prime Minister of Southern Rhodesia for 23 years. He would go on to act as Prime Minister of the Federation until 1956, becoming the longest-serving Prime Minister in British Commonwealth history. Although the African population was approximately 3 million and the European population only about 300,000, Africans were allocated only 6 representatives, 2 from each territory, in a federal legislative assembly of 35 members. This often brought frustration amongst African representatives.
Repeating the same all about economics and social this and that. I have time to waste here. My people want me home. Right now, they want me back home in Nyasaland.
Furthermore, stringent conditions were set by the settler regimes to sideline the majority of Africans from voting. For example, voters were divided into 2 categories, the A and the B row. To qualify for the A row, which elected 50 out of the 65 members of the assembly, the voter had to possess an income of at least £792, with own immovable property worth £1,650. This essentially disqualified most Africans who now played second fiddle in the political affairs of their own countries.
For in the Federation, coloured people outnumber Europeans 30-1. Yet when the Governor-General Lord Llewellyn opened the first federal parliament in 1904, it was essentially a Westminster-type ceremony. And in the copper mines of Northern Rhodesia, third largest producer in the world, the rule is white administration, coloured labour. The same combination constructed the far-famed Kariba Dam. The Federation Premier, Sir Roy Walensky, is in no hurry to change the existing balance between white and coloured races, claiming that in Rhodesia, it is a good, workable arrangement.
The economic reasons behind the establishment of the Federation were even more controversial. Economically, all things considered, Nyasaland was essentially a supplier of cheap labor to Southern Rhodesia farms and mines. Northern Rhodesia contributed its copper export earnings, while the southern colony, the preferred residence of white settlers, enjoyed increased foreign investment, an expanded market, rapid development, and an easy lifestyle.
They believe that if Nyasaland joined the Federation, its budget would be subsidized by the Federation. So Northern Rhodesia at that time was actually cash cow of the Federation. It was process to talk of Phiri, Kitwe. It was to talk of an El Dorado.
From 1953-54, government in Southern Rhodesia made a good propaganda for all the Africans in Southern Rhodesia whose land had been designated to be called European land in the future. And those who felt that the land they had was poor, they were told that we have huge tracts of land and you have this for free across the Zambezi. You go to Northern Rhodesia. So a lot of Zimbabweans, black Zimbabweans, were heavily encouraged to migrate to Northern Rhodesia. And the way they did it was a very smart way. They said, look, there are plenty of cattle there. So what you're not taking is the livestock. Then you buy livestock across the Zambezi. But all your household belongings, you shall put them on the train for free. And they were taken right across to Zambia for free. And the people just said, this is wonderful, for free.
Without a doubt, after its establishment, settlers in Southern Rhodesia accrued more economic benefits from the opportunities availed by the Federation. These included the selection of Southern Rhodesia's capital Salisbury as the citadel of the federal government's power, a tremendous increase in road and rail construction, increased seats in the federal government, construction of the Kariba Dam, and the establishment of the University of Rhodesia and Nyasaland on Southern Rhodesian soil. Though Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland equally received support and funding for projects from the federal government, it goes without saying that Southern Rhodesia got the lion's share. Given the repressive laws and discrimination against Africans, especially in Northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland, it was not long before there was widespread dislike for and agitation against the Federation of Rhodesia and Nyasaland from African leaders in the north. Thus, grievances soon fueled militant African nationalism in all three territories, giving rise to the Malawi Congress Party under Kamuzu Banda, the Zimbabwe African People's Union under Joshua Nkoma, and of course the United National Independence Party, UNIP, under Kenneth Kaunda. And once UNIP was formed, Kenneth Kaunda declared practical war on the Federation, which led to the Chachacha movement, a rebellion meant to make the then Northern Rhodesia ungovernable. In the 1950s, the Central African Territory, known as Northern Rhodesia, had been an involuntary member of a worldwide system of dependencies under British administration for over 70 years. However, in those years, race relations in the region had worsened, with colonialists in the south classifying people racially by obnoxious tests such as a pencil sticking in one's hair, width of the nose, shades of whiteness, and even the opinion of neighbors. And soon, signs of what was happening in the south began showing in Northern Rhodesia. Unwittingly, it was during the same period that the London News Sheet printed in one of its issues a poem entitled Northern Rhodesia Awake. Worse still, from 1939 through to the 1950s, story of man-eating demons spread throughout Chinsali district with anti-colonial and anti-European connotations. The so-called Banyama, derived from a local term meaning meat, described cannibals or vampire-like men that feasted on human flesh. According to one version of the story in Impika in the 1940s, colonial government commissioned and reaped benefits from the activities of Banyama, deriving huge profits from the sale of blood and the fat of their victims. Africans, especially in northern Rhodesia and Nyasaland, consistently opposed the Federation, and many African political activists spread rumors that the Federation was responsible for Banyama, the cannibals or vampire-like men that feasted on human blood. Thus, from the late 1950s onward, Northern Rhodesia's African nationalists, led by the United National Independence Party (UNIP) and Kenneth Kaunda, declared practical war on the Federation and colonialism. However, to effectively achieve their goal, there was one particular organ that they had to infiltrate for their fight to be meaningful: the Northern Rhodesia Legislative Council. The legislature in Northern Rhodesia traces its origins to 1918, when an advisory council composed of 5 nominated members was established during the BSAC's rule. These members were white settlers who had been demanding for a responsible government during the entire BSAC rule era from 1890 to 1924. Following the British government takeover of the Northern Rhodesian Territory from the BSAC, the Advisory Council was transformed into a Legislative Council, which marked the beginning of a new system of governance and administration in Northern Rhodesia. The first Legislative Council meeting was held in Livingstone, the capital of Northern Rhodesia, on 23rd May 1924. By and large, the new governance system based on the Legislative Council enabled white settlers to have a bigger say in the running of the country than they had during the company rule. And in order to support and legalize the existence of the council, constitutional amendments were effected. It must, however, be stated that the Legislative Council was not completely independent from the Colonial Office in London. The powers of this embryonic body were restricted, as the British Parliament remained the ultimate source of all law, with major constitutional and policy changes being effected through the instrument of Order in Council promulgated by the Crown. Now, to be fair, the Legislative Council did attempt to address the interests of Africans indirectly, as its European members believed that Africans needed to be legislated for. Issues pertaining to the welfare of Africans only began to attract attention in the later years. One reason for this was the Passfield Memorandum of 1930, a memorandum on native policy in East Africa, in which the Secretary of State for Colonies, Lord Passfield, affirmed that the British government's opinion advocated for paramountcy of Africans when in conflict with the settlers. Thus, in order to show compliance with the Passfield Memorandum, in 1935, one unofficial member, Colonel Stewart Go Brown, was appointed by the governor to represent African interests. Despite himself being white, Go Brown probably had a closer understanding of the new pressures on African society than any other member of the Legislative Council, having first come to Northern Rhodesia in 1911 and later settled at Chiwangandu in 1921. But in terms of direct African representation, direct African members' representation only began in 1948, partly due to demands for direct representation from African nationalists. However, another threat to African representation arose in the late 1950s, initiated by the man Ian MacLeod, Secretary of State for Colonies. MacLeod's proposal was designed to protect minority Europeans and disenfranchise majority Africans with devalued votes by introducing a very complex system of representation. And despite its complexity, MacLeod's proposals were instrumental in the introduction of the 1962 Constitution, which favored the minority settler communities' hold on power at the expense of the Africans. And thus in July 1961, Kenneth Kaunda rose to speak to 3,000 party delegates at Mulungushi. He began with the ominous statement, "Countrymen, we meet today to decide the future of our country." As Kaunda was speaking, some made reference to a master plan, and there were repeated shouts of approval, and again the word cha-cha-cha was heard. And when asked about the concept, Kaunda replied that cha-cha-cha meant more than political agitation and symbolized a real dance, one in which everyone, Africans and Europeans alike, would participate. Immediately after the Mulungushi Conference in 1961, incidents of violence across northern Rhodesia erupted. As in Nyasaland in 1959, the shout of Kwacha, the dawn is here, and freedom, and the singing of freedom songs were regarded as sedition. Worse still, a member of the Legislative Council was said to have been heard describing UNIP leaders as scum of the earth. While such remarks in the past were tolerated, this time around it was tantamount to outright provocation. In various parts of the country, UNIP declared a boycott of beer halls as a form of rebellion and partly to promote sobriety as a vital part of popular organization. There were also a number of crude attempts at sabotage by UNIP Youth League members in the Copperbelt, while increased movement of police and military vehicles in Wapula province was answered by the ditching of a number of bridges on the main roads. Meanwhile, in a letter to Dear Freedom Fighters, in the voice of UNIP, Mainza Chona wrote,
"You are all standing at attention, waiting for the green light to the master plan. Some of you are tired of waiting. At the Mulungushi Conference, you were told to be on your marks, get set. But you remember, you gave emergency powers to the national president. He alone is responsible for directing Cha-Cha-Cha, so he has to make a careful assessment before he can give the word. Go."
In his encrypted remarks, despite Mainza Chona seemingly arguing that the green light for the master plan had not been given by Kaunda, he ended his speech with a grave word on the coming struggle. UNIP reports of the first wave of incidents after Mulungushi listed 60 people arrested in Kitwe in a pre-dawn raid and quoted a press notice of the death of an ANC official who had been organizing opposition to the beer hall boycott. UNIP headquarters further received reports in Wapula province of police provocation, requesting a national official to go north to calm the situation. According to the report, several bridges had been destroyed and many people arrested. Southern province officials alleged police bribery of ANC members to further block the beer hall boycotts, which were seen to be effective, especially in the Lusaka region. Relations between party officials and the authorities in Barotseland were reasonably fair, while in Eastern Province, UNIP was battling against ANC attempts to persuade people to register as voters under the new constitution. Despite the happenings around the country, everywhere he went on his tours, Kaunda appealed insistently for non-violence. It would seem that without physical violence to persons, the thousands of party members and their allies in different provinces of northern Rhodesia were beginning what was in effect a sabotage campaign without awaiting a direct order from their leader. Kaunda was convinced after his tours that the mood across the country was charged. It seemed somehow that the trigger had been pulled before the order was given, and it was when Kaunda was at Dar es Salaam that a correspondent from the London Daily Mail in Lusaka called him with the question,
"Have you heard what is happening at home? They are burning their identity cards. Is that in order?"
And Kaunda replied,
"Yes, this is the first part of the master plan."
In the Samfya area, where there had been early disenchantment with Haring Kumbula's leadership and where first Zank and then UNIP had gained very large following, local testimony indicates that the mass burning of Ifitupa, as African identification certificates were called, was done 5 days before Kaunda burned his own in Lusaka. The burning at Samfya was followed the next day by a similar action on the island of Chishi, where people burned Ifitupa and Imichato or marriage certificates, which was symbolic of a radical rejection of colonial rule. By this time, recalls Mama Chola of Mwense,
"We realized that Cha-Cha-Cha had started. Straight away we started collecting identification and marriage certificates, even from those who did not attend the meeting, and we visited the homes of all the elderly people who had not come because of the cold weather. They surrendered heaps and heaps of certificates, and when it struck after midnight, we set these ablaze."
Meanwhile, Kaunda was now in London, stressing his commitment to non-violence and fighting for the country's independence. In the UK, Kaunda is said to have been poisoned, though it was determined that it was only mild food poisoning. And a few days later, he was on his way back to Lusaka. His talks in London, though still inconclusive, were the final attempt and gave some hope. A final breakdown in negotiations would have forced the implementation of the third stage of the master plan, the burning of the identification certificates and the destruction of roads and bridges being the first two stages. In fact, the plan had overlapped, with the first two stages occurring simultaneously. Though Kaunda himself denied further stages of the master plan beyond destruction of roads and bridges, Lewis Changuku, mastermind of Chachacha, hinted that the subsequent stages of the plan were much more brutal. In London, Kaunda was encouraged as he had access not only to Ian MacLeod but also to the Minister of State Lord Perth and the Commonwealth Relations Secretary Duncan Sandys. The British ministers declared their willingness on cessation of violence to consider representations of divergent views about details of the proposed constitution. This, Kenneth said in Nairobi, would spell new hope for the troubled country. And the London Voice of Zambia reported that Kaunda had finally decided to suspend the campaign of protest and to try once more to make the British government see reason.
The British people and the people of all races in northern Rhodesia have not only their best friend, but also their last friend in Mr. Kaunda.